I'm talking about an interesting subject this morning, downfall and return. And I was thinking just about the title and the experiences I've listened to and from various men and women on the path over the years. And this is what I've found is the people who have been on the path sometimes for years, and then something happens in their life that I don't want to say takes them off the spiritual path, but creates a diversion, and they veer away from the path for a few years. Sometimes when people veer away from the path, they don't return in this lifetime. But for those that do, they capture a joy, bring a joy into their nature, into their thinking, into their life that wasn't there before. And of course that gives me great joy as well, because I'm part of it and I get to listen to their experiences and their renewed vigor for their own life and wanting to put their life in order in such a way that no more diversions are going to take place, no more distractions are going to take place. And they have a real strong sense of direction now. I think that these diversions and these veering off the path sometimes is karma, sometimes is the result of outer influences that we could say are temptations. Temptations for disbelief, doubt. But that return, there's nothing like it. So I just wanted to share that with you this morning. So, downfall and return. The essence of today's talk is most positive and affirming and explanatory of the challenges that we as spiritual students experience on the path. This is called the path of transformation, the path of initiation, and all that we undergo and experience. The information I'm sharing today has been in part compiled from the writings of the Tibetan D.K. and Torgum Serdarian. This talk will include the experiences that spiritual students go through as they travel the path of initiation, both the highs and the lows. This talk is designed to give hope to the student who has left the path, or to the one who now finds themselves plummeting into a downward cycle, and affirming for one who is returning to their higher ideals. So let me begin. In the teaching, there are three major stages of consciousness experienced on the path of transformation and initiation. These stages are the consciousness of the aspirant, the consciousness of the disciple, and the consciousness of the initiate. So these are three stages. For the aspirant, all aspirants have taken the first of 9 initiations. This fact is demonstrated by the person's intensive struggle to grow into a spiritual life. They are struggling to follow the way of determined direction and orientation to the things of the Spirit and to live by the light of that Spirit. This is a stage that the teaching calls mysticism. It's pure mysticism and personal, personal, sometimes called selfish. And you'll understand what I mean by that when you meet, a person whose consciousness is there. It's like they become almost fanatic about being on the path. But it's a beautiful thing, because what is happening now at this stage, again, of the aspirant, is they are coming into themselves, becoming somebody. Whereas before they were, could I say this? They're just kind of a random individual. But now they've come to a point where they're so hungry to become centered in something different than that randomness life that they're experiencing, that it's just natural for them to appear to be very fanatical and selfish. But they grow from that, thank God. The recognition of the necessity group relationship is missing. The knowledge of group predisposition is not yet present with the aspirant. There is no evidence of an unselfish desire to serve. There is only a vague desire for personal liberation, personal integrity, and for personal, lasting spiritual happiness. So the first stage in the training of an aspirant is to connect with an advancing disciple who will lead them gradually onward and give them the help that they don't know they need. The disciple is striving on the path of transformation and is seeking ways to selflessly serve without reward. So you see how this works together. This stage of development of the aspirant finds them engaged in the discovery of esoteric analysis, research, and investigation, which typically covers several lifetimes. Esoteric analysis, research, and investigation. It is at this stage the aspirant runs from one teacher to another, according to their inclination, their opportunity, and necessity. The aspirant will be an example of instability, but is carefully watched by the disciple who at one time went through and transcended this stage of unpredictability. The task of the disciple is to see that the aspirant escapes from this network of futility, as it is sometimes called, so that the aspirant eventually and finally settles down to the later stage of inner investigation. See, up until that time, the analysis, the research, the investigation is all outward. And then at one point in the stage of their development, now they're ready for inner investigation. So during the many lives of the aspirant, their consciousness is going to transition from the astral plane to the mental. And will, at this point, this person will become a more senior aspirant who can now help others in the process of their transformation, giving a certain amount of aid and guidance. It's like, this is the way I see it. It's so beautiful. It's like, it's natural. It's a natural process of being on a spiritual path. It's not something dictated by a tradition or a religion or an institution. It is a natural unfolding process. And if you look at your own life, particularly if you've been on the path for quite a while, you're going to see this whole process take place from the aspirant to being a senior and aspirant to the disciple that has helped you, and how everything seems to progress forward in such a way that you recognize a spiritual maturity taking place in that individual. Again, it's not tradition, it's not dogma, it's not religion, it's not the dictates coming from an institution of any kind. It is as natural as the 4 seasons of life, of the environment, of the climate. It's so natural. So this is why when we start on the path, we're not going to study with a physicist. If you've ever been around a physicist, they talk a completely different language. It's like, what? You want somebody that is close enough to the experiences they had that you are now going through, that they can relate to it. And that understanding and that relationship is full of love and patience and understanding and tolerance and non-judgmentalness. It is really, really beautiful. During this stage of their journey, the aspirant eventually learns to distinguish and appreciate the poles of opposite, good and bad, light and darkness, masculine and feminine, above and below, and so forth. The challenge is to find the way between the pairs of opposites and eventually step into balance and a state of equilibrium, no longer being pulled between one or the other. At this point, the aspirant is moving more toward a state of integration and stability. And the person's illumination is increasing. The aspirant is also becoming increasingly aware of their glamours and yearn to free themselves from such powerful control. It is at this time the aspirant looks around and sees life as through a fog. The fogs and mists of glamour, the glamours which they must dispel to move ahead. They must transmute the glamours through the burning rays of radiant light and with the help of their teacher. This is a most difficult and painful experience, for the aspirant is now by unconscious choice forcing themselves to see their many false selves and lack of soul freedom. Yet this is the process. This is the process of dissipating the fog. It is difficult at best and intensely challenging. This stage often finds the aspirant filled with self-doubt. So in retrospect, moving from living a life of an ordinary person to that of an aspirant, there was a moment in which the now aspirant underwent an experience of illumination, followed by a desire to change themselves, giving them the aspiration to live life differently. So an aspirant is not an ordinary or average person. And though they are unaware of the fact, the master is keeping an eye on that person. In other words, the master has an interest in them. The master is receiving regular reports. This is very interesting. The master is receiving regular reports based on certain charts from the senior disciple who has been assigned to the aspirant. See, all this stuff, oh, that's a horrible word. This whole process is taking place unknowingly to the aspirant. They're not aware of it yet. But it is a process that is taking place. The aspirant, having begun the process of transformation long ago, perhaps even 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, is now trying to live in the light of their higher self. Every month, consciously or unconsciously, they will make contact with the light of their higher self. And this contact is either going to elevate them or creates a disturbance in their life. Aspirants will come in contact with their higher self through intense pain and suffering. Some will come in contact during a moment of severe failure. Some will come in contact when they are deeply insulted or even shamed. When such an experience occurs, the person, the aspirant, comes to their senses, and their viewpoints and standards undergo change. It is at this juncture that they will return to their upward cycle. So you see how being on the spiritual path, it's not so unusual to see a person veer off for a while and then come back. Now, a disciple. A disciple can be found at many stages, from the little disciple of the first degree to the one who is in the heart of the master, and finally the one who gives all that he has to the service for humanity. The esoteric school trains the disciple in group work. The disciple learns to relinquish their personality plans in the interest of group purpose, ever directed to the service of humanity and the hierarchy. This is an important point to remember, really important point, so that you as a disciple clearly understands the underlying purpose for training in group work. It is to be of direct and guided service through the hierarchy and their influences. They become merged. The disciple becomes merged in group activities, and yet losing none, and this is another important point, losing none of their individualized and particularized identity. In fact, what I find is just the opposite takes place in terms of recognizing finally who they are. They are becoming someone. See that? They are becoming someone. They're no longer a random individual in life. They are becoming someone. And in the process of becoming someone, it is the light of their higher self is, how can I say it, is radiating a light and love energy that begins to expose the potential that disciple brought with them into each life. now that potential is finally, in part, being realized. And in that realization, they are becoming someone. And thus, they're not going to lose their identity, their sense of true self. They become a dedicated server to the plan of hierarchy. And such a person will be filled with humility. This is how you can always tell an individual, a disciple of a certain degree, is their humility. They know who they are, and in that knowledge have humility. That humility is what drives them to serve hierarchy. The disciple of humility has no thought of their personal opinions, prejudice, and flawed judgmental thinking. The disciple, through their esoteric education, is taught to live normally, practically. They're very practical human beings. So they live normally and practically and effectively, yet spiritually, in their day-to-day life. See, now there's no veering off course. They are taught the why and the wherefore of circumstances and happenings, both as an individual and universally. And they are thus trained to function as a light bearer. Let me share a story about an Armenian saint as told by Torquem Saradarian. There was an Armenian saint in the 10th or 11th century. His name was Grigor Nergatse, who used to talk with Christ. Now let me pause a minute. I had to do a little research. I wanted to find out who Grigor was. And this is what I learned, that he was an Armenian mystical and lyrical poet. He was a monk and he was a theologian. He is now venerated as a saint in the Armenian I'm so sorry, I can't pronounce this. Apostolic, is that right? Apostolic, thank you. The Apostolic and Catholic churches, and was declared a doctor of the church by Pope Francis in 2015. Isn't that interesting? Despite my not being able to pronounce that word. So Grigor Nergatse used to talk with Christ. Torquem said, if you know Armenian, I will give you the books to read of how he used to talk with him. Let me tell that story. It is so beautiful. He said it was witnessed by all his disciples. He was walking in the street, Grigor was walking in the street and saw a wounded man lying in the street. His disciples said, he is already dying. The saint said, no, I cannot leave that man there. Like Mother Teresa, he said, I can't leave that man there. Let me take him. So they put him on the saint's back. Suddenly, while they were walking, they realized that the wounded man was not on the saint's back. He was walking beside the saint. The saint looked at him and said, oh, it is my Lord. Yes. The disciple's private life automatically falls, once he has been accepted by the master, into 3 stages. The first stage, in which the lower concrete mind and the higher mind are related in such a manner that the lower mind is not only now illumined by the higher self, but is also subject to impression from the spiritual triad. That's the first stage. The next stage is their relation to the master, and sometimes a paralleling stage, and involves the bringing together of the master's consciousness with their own. This has to be slowly developed and consciously grasped, with very interesting consequences. And then the third stage. Later comes this stage when the disciple's consciousness can be gradually brought into relationship with the hierarchy as a whole. The disciple becomes absorbed into the hierarchy, and they assimilate in a new and mysterious manner certain united hierarchical impressions. See the stages? It is so beautiful. Disciples are recognized. How are they recognized? They're recognized through their dedication, through their energy, and through their creativity. They live their life by the 5 principles of beauty and goodness, right human relations, joy, and freedom. Any violation against these 5 principles, and listen to this, any violation against these 5 principles throws the person out of the path of discipleship. See, there's built-in laws that the disciple recognizes and feels in their heart, and these laws are all related to the 5 principles. These laws are all related to the 5 principles. An initiate is a person who has consciously chosen to travel the path of initiation. An initiate is understood as one who has passed the 3rd initiation. A disciple is also on the path of initiation, but oftentimes gets stuck. For example, at the early stages of initiation, it is easier for the disciple to fall into the abyss by turning against the teacher. This, of course, delays their progress. Sometime I would love just to sit down and have a discussion together as to how such an event can take place. But this too is, the way I recognize it, is almost built into the process of the advancing consciousness. We run into these obstacles that seem to be built into the path, and thus they're natural. And it's a challenge to our faith. It's a challenge to practicing these laws that are not written laws, so to speak, not in Times Roman font, for example. It's like laws that are thought forms in space that become incorporated into our consciousness. And so events take place that challenge us in such a way that can turn us against the teacher. And this is what I would love to sit down and discuss, because I've experienced it, not experienced it personally, but experienced it through others, and how they turned against the teacher, and how it delayed their progress. It's very interesting to learn about and to talk about. So the disciple can go to the second initiation and get stuck there. The initiate can go to the third initiation, but not make the fourth. Once the disciple becomes an initiate of the third degree, it is rare. It is very rare to find that person living in disharmony with their ideals. Still, they must be cautious not to become stuck in their identification with the ideal. It sometimes takes 3,000 to 4,000 lives between initiations. I know, it's so slow. Now, how does the downfall of a disciple occur? Downfall means the person turns against the teaching and the teacher. And when the person turns against the teaching and the teacher, this of course means everything that the teaching and the teacher stands for, they turn against. First, the disciple that identified with the ideals of the teaching becomes influenced by their family, by their friends, or society to doubt the high ideals of the teaching. No doubt you have experienced this. Experienced what? Being influenced by your family and your friends and society. To doubt karma and reincarnation. Where they trusted the wisdom of the teacher, now they begin to replace their humility with vanity and with ego. Where they elevate themselves over the experience and over the illumination of the teacher. Next, the disciple is attracted to strong ideas, although these strong ideas are of a low order, a low frequency, more dense. Or they're attracted to people or objects that have caused them to live in ways that are not in harmony with the high ideals of the teaching. Next, over time, the disciple slowly identifies with the lower forms, the lower senses of living, and then justify their actions. Every time the higher ideals remind the person about their failures, they have feelings against the ideals, against the teaching, and against the teacher. Then the person becomes curiously afraid of the ideals in various ways, eventually hating them. Seems almost impossible to understand this, but it is possible, and it does happen, and it happens more frequently than not. Fear is another. Fear causes cleavages and confusion and hatred as well as obsession. When there is a conflict or attack between a strongly held high thought form, a higher ideal, and the object of the senses, a cleavage is eventually produced. Cleavages scatter the mind, and the person enters into confusion. Here's a quote: "A confused mind works against its own survival." Remember, I'm sure some of you do that have been in White Mountain classes, we went through a period of time of talking about and trying to understand confusion to a point where we said, don't use that word. Don't say, I'm so confused, because that in itself creates confusion. Interesting how cleavages scatter the mind and the person enters into confusion. There are certain events that contribute to the aspirant or the immature disciple's downfall. They find themselves in conflict with the higher ideals, going through a period of irrationality, being inclined toward lower ways of living, or breaking the 5 principles that they had once highly believed in. Cleavages, antagonism, and hatred can cause the person's downfall, causing them to lose respect for their co-worker and even their teacher. Exhaustion and delusionment. What they were hoping to be rewarded with did not manifest. For example, money, rewards of power, love relationships that were ultimately unfulfilling, devotion from others, freedom from karma, and depression. But there is hope for return. And this is what the teaching tells us. How is there hope for return? How does it happen? By contacting certain ideals that are still in their heart. Memories of joy during those times of high contact. Renunciation. Returning to meditation. And returning to the former ideals they believed so much in. During the descent of the aspirant or disciple, the earthly teacher will give the person a few strong warnings. If the person does not heed the warnings, the teacher may withdraw in silence and leave the person to their karma. A disciple's life is a life of increasing spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity is the degree of progress the person makes by overcoming their glamours and illusions. Glamours exercise great power over the aspirant and the immature disciple's actions, emotions, thoughts, and relationships. Illusions are mistranslations of revelations and high ideas. The disciple's mental nature is not yet adequately developed or has hindrances and frozen thoughts from this or former lifetimes. Revelations and ideas which radiate currents that come from the master or the solar angel are mistranslated. So how does this happen? The current comes to your mind and you mistranslate it. It is like the teacher says something and you mistranslate it. This mistranslation is the mixture of your personal expectations and interests, and thus an illusion occurs. Illusions are those thought forms which contain distorted facts. Illusions occur when the unfolding human soul is focused in the lower mind, or between the lower and higher mind, and as such, when revelations seemingly come into the thoughts of the disciple, the current of the revelation loses its purity and charge and is now mistranslated by the person's lower mind. illusions make the disciple's mind separative and believes that all that he or she knows is the last word. The person becomes egocentric, bossy, domineering, a know-it-all, and oftentimes even eccentric. Maturity on the path of discipleship is recognized in those advancing disciples on the ascending path who do not force their will upon others, who do not use people for themselves. They are not manipulators. They do not run after their vanities. They do not let the most essential disappear from their touch or contact. They stand like a rock while the sunrise and the sunset hit their faces, while snow and rain fall upon their heads, while lightning hits their heart. Through all of these things, they remain steady as they walk toward hierarchy and Shambhala. They can play with children. They can sit and talk with aged ones and can be with teenagers, but will always be aware that they are a soul. So let me close with this. When the disciple accomplishes all the above, their consciousness is now that of an initiate. In the life of discipleship, there are many failures and many successes. Failure comes into being when they identify with their lower bodies and their toys. Success comes into being when the disciple withdraws into their essential self. So that's today's talk. Condensed. Very condensed. Let me tell you, sharing this information with you is like you can take one idea and discuss it for hours. It is so amazing. And that's what esoteric teaching is. It takes us into so many levels of understanding. So anyway, downfall and return. I hope you enjoy it.